Mosaic, a daily news program from Link TV, presents a selection of news reports from independent and state-controlled broadcasters from throughout the Middle East.
Qurra submits his resignation to Arafat after the Palestinian Legislative Council postponed approval of the new government until next Saturday. An Egyptian medical team says that Arafat's health condition is poor after having a heart attack. Arafat's doctor in Jordan denies that Arafat had a heart attack, saying that he only suffers from the flu and a stomach virus. Sharon attacks the Labour Party after news was leaked about the negotiations between the Israeli left and Palestinians.
There are now similar groups to those who call themselves the Israeli opposition, who committed certain acts during the war. They are working with the Palestinians behind the government's back.
2 Israeli soldiers were wounded in a martyrdom operation carried out by a Palestinian woman near a military checkpoint in Tulkarm, north of the West Bank. Thousands of Shiites demonstrate to protect the office of Muqtada Sidr in Baghdad after U.S. forces surrounded it. Meanwhile, 10 people were killed in an explosion targeting the police station in Sidr city. The Spanish ambassador in Baghdad was assassinated after leaving his home. Syria says that the vote of the International Relations Committee in the U.S. House of Representatives on a resolution to impose economic sanctions on the country is a dangerous step and a violation of international law. This is the end of the news in brief. In Iraq, a police station in Sidr was attacked, killing 10 people, including the bomber himself, 3 policemen, and 6 civilians, in addition to wounding about 20 others.
6 months have passed since the collapse of Baghdad and Saddam Hussein's regime crumbled. A strong explosion rattled the city of Sadr, formerly known as Saddam City. The explosion occurred at an Iraqi police station.
Approximately 8:45 hours this morning.
At approximately 8:45 hours this morning, a man driving a car approached the entrance of the police station, opened fire at 2 policemen guarding the entrance, then went through the gates and detonated a container inside the station.
Opened fire on the 2.
This is the second car bomb explosion targeting the Iraqi police. A similar attack occurred at a police station in Al Rusafa last month. The explosion site was in turmoil, thus the police command demanded that reporters evacuate the area.
We are taking all measures, and I hope that after this interview, you will all leave for your safety.
The wounded were transported to nearby hospitals. Meanwhile, many Iraqis arrived at the explosion site looking for their relatives who were at the police station at that time. This explosion happened in a Shiite area, hence proving that the current security strategies are unsuccessful in providing security to Iraq. Meanwhile, demonstrating that suicide bombers can attack anywhere and at any time as they please. After the withdrawal of the Israeli occupation forces from southern Lebanon in May 2000, the Lebanese collaborators, who were known as the soldiers of Antoine Laht, escaped to Israel seeking refuge. Today, 3 years after moving to Israel, these traitors are trying to return to Lebanon because they failed to find peace of mind and a decent life. They preferred Israel over their homeland, which they sold out for a cheap price.
بعد موجة نزوحهم إلى إسرائيل طلبا للحماية.
Waves of Lebanese collaborators went to Israel for protection, but now they are fleeing Israel, seeking a decent life in Lebanon. After the Israeli withdrawal from southern Lebanon in May 2000, the Southern Lebanese Army, also known as Laht's soldiers, believed that the Hebrew state would receive them with flowers and open arms for what they did for Israel. They gave Israel their full cooperation and pointed Israeli weapons against their own people. Now they are holding demonstrations to protest the lack of money, food, and respect.
Shame on you. You are dogs. You are dogs. We are starving.
The future of former southern Lebanese soldiers is a very sensitive issue. They do not want to disclose their identity because they fear for their lives. We had to go far to the north in Nahriya to see closely how they are living on a daily basis. This is what we encountered.
It is forbidden for people to take pictures here.
Can we talk to you? Tell us, what is your name?
Abu Sliman.
Why don't you stop?
You should leave. Do not take pictures here.
With extreme difficulty, we managed to convince Muhammad's wife, who was a soldier in Lah's army, to speak to us. Muhammad refused to talk to us. His father intervened and informed us that his son held an important position in the southern Lebanese army. The family told us about the economic hardships they are facing within Israel and their desire to return to Lebanon.
Unfortunately, we can't go back to Lebanon. We're not allowed to. We're wanted by 3 different groups, the Druze, the Christians, and Muslims. We can't go back until Nasrallah says that it's okay.
Why isn't Nasrallah allowing you to return?
Because we are collaborators, they say we are traitors.
What do you think? Are you traitors?
Yes, we collaborated with Israel.
The former Laht soldiers offered Hezbollah thousands of dollars in compensation so they would be allowed to return.
9 years ago, my father was killed in Lebanon for the sake of Israel. And what did the Israeli government do in return? They turned their back on us and refused to help us.
About 6,500 Laht soldiers escaped to Israel. So far, 4,226 of them have returned to Lebanon. Upon arrival in Lebanon, they must surrender themselves to Hezbollah or other Lebanese entities for questioning. Then, a decision has to be made as to whether they can return to their homes or stay for further interrogation. It is impossible to buy or sell someone's homeland without evoking an internal struggle between feelings of dignity and selfishness. These 2 contradictory sentiments can never meet. It is a fundamental principle in life. The struggle must be taking place inside the southern Lebanese army, or Laht soldiers. On one hand, Israel refuses to help them, and on the other hand, Hezbollah and the Lebanese government view them as traitors because they collaborated with their primary enemy, Israel.
Ankara's decision to send troops into occupied Iraq caused a wave of objection from within Turkey and inside Iraq. U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld denied any Iraqi official or non-official growing opposition to the Turkish decision as he faced the White House shakeup to tighten its control over operations in Iraq, suggesting dissatisfaction with the defense secretary.
The Turkish decision to send troops to Iraq stirred up an historical enmity between Baghdad and Ankara. Iraqis say Turkey is interested in Iraq's oil, and they expressed their rejection to such a decision, as well as their readiness to confront Turkish troops should they deploy in the country.
We don't need any forces from any neighboring country. Let them protect their country and leave us to protect our own.
For their part, Kurdish parties firmly rejected any deployment of Turkish troops in Iraq.
The firm rejection of deploying Turkish troops in Iraq came from President Masoud Barzani. We will act according to events. We don't want to enter a conflict with a neighboring country like Turkey, with which we share a good neighboring policy.
According to Manar channel sources in Baghdad, the Iraqi Governing Council unanimously decided to oppose the Turkish decision. The sources added that the American administrator of occupied Iraq, Paul Bremer, banned the council from distributing a statement clarifying their position.
No, we knew they had concerns. I think it is a matter that we're going to continue talking to them in the next in the period ahead. I've stressed to the governing council that under international law, the coalition is responsible for security here, and in the end, we have to make our own decisions.
Governing Council current President Ayad Alawi held talks with Turkey's ambassador to Iraq, Othman Baksat, over the issue, and the meeting was reported to have been very stormy. For its part, U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld denied Wednesday there was a growing Iraqi opposition to the deployment of Turkish troops or reports of an Iraqi Governing Council unanimous vote for that matter, and claimed that Turkish forces were needed until Iraqi forces were capable of providing security. Rumsfeld said Bremer and the head of the Central Command, General John Abizaid, were working with Iraqis and other countries to enable the deployment of Turkish troops in the country to the satisfaction of the Iraqis and U.S. commanders. Dissatisfaction with Rumsfeld's dealing with post-war Iraq was behind the White House National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice's decision to create a new U.S. National Security Council oversight group for Iraq. A classified memo issued last week established the so-called Iraq Stabilization Group within the White House under Rice's control, shifting the control of the Iraqi dossier away from the Pentagon. Rumsfeld acknowledged Wednesday he was not consulted about the White House shakeup, claiming he did not feel his authority had been diminished behind his back.
Your authority in Iraq?
Not at all, Charlie. The reality is that the National Security Council's responsibility is to do exactly what this one-page memo says they should do. It happened that it apparently was discussed at the undersecretary or the assistant secretary level and not at my level. It need not have been. It is not a problem or an issue.
The United States, meanwhile, faces a new setback at the United Nations as its draft resolution on Iraq appears to have been put on hold after criticism from UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. A disagreement over how soon Iraqis could take political control over the country and how big a UN role might be during that transition led Annan to come out against the U.S. proposal last week in remarks that galvanized its opponents. Annan said that the limited role offered by the United States was not worth the risk to the world body.
After having a bullet inside his chest for 5 months, 4-year-old Iraqi Salim Mohammed is recovering after a life-saving operation Wednesday. After 4 hours, surgeons extracted the bullet. They said the surgery went better than they could have hoped for. Doctors have described Salim's progress as a miracle. He survived the initial shooting, 5 months with a bullet lodged by his heart, waiting for surgery because of a shortage of medical supplies, and finally a complicated surgical procedure. On the wake of the Israeli aggression against Syria, a U.S. House of Representatives committee voted Wednesday to impose economic and diplomatic sanctions against Syria after the White House dropped its opposition to such punitive steps. Israel welcomed the move, and Israeli military chief of staff Moshe Ya'alon said his country should continue to act against Syria, which he called, quote, a terrorist state. Meanwhile, the United Nations called on both Syria and Israel to practice restraint.
The U.S. House of Representatives International Relations Committee voted 33-2 in favor of diplomatic and economic sanctions on Syria, accusing it of supporting terrorism and developing weapons of mass destruction. One of the bill's main sponsors, Eliot Engel, a Democrat from New York, said this legislation will send a message to Damascus and the world that the United States will hold accountable nations that support so-called terrorist groups. Moving in the same direction, White House spokesman Scott McClellan said U.S. President George W. Bush has ended 2 years of opposition to the legislation. He told reporters Syria needs to change course, change its behavior, and stop harboring what he called terrorists. Meanwhile, Germany, France, and Spain noted that the Syrian draft resolution circulated at the United Nations Security Council on the wake of the Israeli aggression against Syria must be more balanced for these nations to back it. Arab UN delegations quoted Syrian UN Ambassador Faisal Maqdad as saying Damascus might reconsider this country's call, but not that of Britain, to condemn the Haifa Palestinian martyrdom operation to gain the British and the US vote. Diplomats said in this case, Syria prefers a US veto because a veto highlights the discrepancies between the Europeans and Washington, Israel's closest ally. In Beirut, UN Middle East envoy Terry Rod Larson was received by President Emil Lahoud among other senior officials. Lahoud told Larson that Lebanon and Syria's resorting to the UN Security Council showed a continuing confidence in the international community's ability to restrain the use of force and prevent the recurrence of unjustified Israeli aggressions.
We are particularly concerned that this attack has the potential to broaden the scope of current conflicts in the Middle East and threaten peace and security throughout the region. Attacks and counterattacks like these are leading us down a steep and precarious path towards more violence. Today, I seriously advise the parties not to travel down that road. Instead, all parties should respect Security Council resolutions and the rules of international law.
Washington this time has made clear it supports Israel's new rules of the game, that of striking Syrian soil, and inflammatory comments from Tel Aviv raised concern that a new conflict could break out.
The Palestinian Parliament session, where new Prime Minister Ahmed Quraysh was to outline his government's program, has been postponed indefinitely. Acting Speaker Ibrahim Abu Najah said Thursday. Because of differences in opinion about the government, it has been decided to postpone the decision indefinitely, as Abu Najah told deputies. Israeli occupation forces continue imposing the strict closure in all Gaza governorates for the 6th day running, where the occupation army opened partially Salah ad-Din Road for 2 hours. Meanwhile, a number of tanks are still stationed in the surrounding area of Morak settlement and far towards the citizens' houses. In Rafah Governorate, Israeli occupation forces demolished a house and a store for agricultural tools in Arabiya area northwest of Rafah. The occupation forces also demolished another house in Zorb suburb near the borderline with Egypt. Meanwhile, the occupation forces raised Wednesday 160 dinars from Rafah land, whereas Media Department of the Agriculture Ministry reported that the Israeli army continued raising operations for the 3rd day running to the agricultural areas, vegetables, citrus, fruits, and palms. Israeli occupation army raided Thursday Beit al-Ma camp in Nablus Governorate and imposed curfew on the citizens. In Jericho, occupation army continued their oppressive measures for the 2nd day running. Our reporter said that the occupation army sealed off the main entries to Jericho and closed the Iron Gate east of the Tayasir village, which connects the Aghwar area in the north. Israeli occupation army leveled a number of agricultural land west of Hussein village at the Mashahid area in Bethlehem Governorate to establish an occupation military camp in the area. Israeli occupation forces continued imposing the curfew on the city and camp of Jenin, where tens of thousands are unable to leave their houses. Meanwhile, Jenin witnessed in the last 2 days a wide arresting campaign and tightened siege, as well as erecting military roadblocks and prevented the citizens from movement. On the other hand, Israeli occupation army paralyzed the educational life for the 2nd day running school of Silvit Governorate, where they prevented more than 50 teachers to reach their schools in the western villages of the governorate. The Education Directorate was obliged to arrange schedule for the teachers inside their villages to cover the shortage caused by occupation blockades. Excuse me. Also, occupation forces barred the farmers in Kufr al-Haris to reach their olive fields. Israeli occupation forces imposed curfew on Tol Karim city during their incursion to the area. Meanwhile, Israeli occupation forces informed the owners of 67 donums in Hebron that they intend to capture the area for absolute military goals. These donums lie between Al-Buera and Lebqea village near Kiryat Arba and Kharasina settlements. In Jerusalem, 4 Israeli Army Reserve units are to be deployed to the West Bank and Gaza Strip from October to 22nd as part of a host of security measures, allegedly to foil feared attacks by Palestinians. Israeli radio said Defense Minister Shaul Mofaz had decided to deploy the units to the West Bank towns of Jenin, Tol Karim, Qalqilia, and Ramallah, as well as in Gaza. Mofaz said that the call-up of the reservists was needed as the Israeli people will not tolerate a new attack like last Saturday's in Haifa, the radio added. There was no immediate confirmation of the decision. An Army source said that the option of deploying a limited number of reserve forces is being examined, adding that a decision has already been made to hold training courses in order to allow any deployment.
And on the ground, Israeli forces have arrested more than a dozen Palestinians in the West Bank raids and kept in place a crippling blockade on the Palestinian territories. Troops in Nablus carried out a series of arrests hours after the Palestinian gunmen opened fire on an Israeli military vehicle, wounding 3 soldiers. Troops arrested at least 2 Palestinians and clashed with Palestinian youth who burnt tires and threw stones at the soldiers. In further sweeps, Israeli troops in Jenin arrested 15 Palestinians, including 7 Islamic Jihad members. In Tulkarem, a Palestinian suicide bomber struck at an Israeli army checkpoint, wounding at least 2 soldiers and 1 Palestinian. Israeli military sources said it was not clear whether the attack was carried out by a man or a woman. In further violence, a Palestinian boy was critically wounded in the head by Israeli army fire in Qalqilia, near the controversial security fence Israel is constructing on occupied West Bank territory. Israel has been on high alert against suicide bombings, ordering troop reinforcements into Palestinian areas and clearing the way for a call-up of army reservists. The occupation army indefinitely extended a total closure of the West Bank and Gaza. Palestinians warned the closure would further devastate the Palestinian economy and cause a humanitarian disaster.
Well, I think the Israeli government action vis-a-vis tightening the closure and the siege, turning our towns, villages and refugee camps into big prisons. There's no movement whatsoever. I came from Jericho this morning where all the vegetables are rotting. Nobody can move their goods from a city to another. It's a total economic devastation, total humanitarian devastation. If this prevails, it will lead to a human catastrophe, a real human catastrophe. There is no movement, no entry of food, medicine, and fuel to our towns, villages, and refugee camps.
And over to Iraq, a Spanish diplomat, a U.S. soldier, and at least 10 Iraqis died in separate attacks, showing how fragile security still is half a year since U.S. troops occupied Baghdad. Iraq's governing council and the U.S. administration failed to resolve their most serious dispute to date over plans to deploy Turkish troops to help stabilize the country. And in a new push to defend the war in the face of mounting doubts, President Bush said he acted to protect Americans from Saddam Hussein. More with Barkuzar Dubati.
6 months in Iraq, more attacks, more disorder, and still no hard evidence on weapons of mass destruction. After the celebration of the fall of the statue, what happened in Iraq has left Iraqis, Arabs, Americans, and British increasingly discontent with the reasons for the war and the length of the occupation. Triple attacks across Iraq left at least 10 Iraqis, a U.S. soldier, and a Spanish diplomat dead. In Baghdad's bloodiest attack for weeks, police said 2 suicide bombers crashed an old American car through a police station's gates, killing 2 policemen and 6 civilians, and wounding dozens in the blast. In another part of the city, Jose Antonio Bernal, an Air Force sergeant at Spain's embassy, was chased from his home by 3 assailants and gunned down, barefoot. Witness accounts underline the lawlessness dominating life in occupied Iraq.
3 people came, knocked on the gate, the diplomat opened the door, they fought with each other, and the deputy ran out of the house. The attackers shot him, he fell, they caught up with him and shot him again.
Northeast of Baghdad, a U.S. soldier died when a rocket-propelled grenade hit his convoy. He is the 92nd soldier to die since U.S. President George W. Bush declared major combat over on May 1st. In Ramadi, witnesses say a U.S. convoy was attacked. A Humvee was damaged and there was no immediate report on injuries. There was also no report on casualties in the city of Tikrit, where a transport train was derailed by a landmine placed on tracks. Diplomatically, the U.S. was also on the defense. Unable to provide stability and fully restore basic services, Washington has appealed for troops and money from other countries, including those that opposed the invasion in the first place, but with little luck. Many European countries, including Germany, which are pressing for a bigger UN role in Iraq, have hinted they might postpone a donors conference. They are casting doubt on the prospects for the conference this month in Spain, unless the United States accepts a UN resolution giving more say to the United Nations and Iraqis. Washington has signaled it might abandon the draft resolution. And with the heat on him, with growing accusations from Americans that he tricked them into war, President Bush opened defense on his war decision, clearly eyeing next year's election. Bush spoke about evidence U.S. investigators had found in Iraq to support his claim that Baghdad had weapons of mass destruction, though not disclosing what they were.
Since the liberation of Iraq, our investigators have found evidence of a clandestine network of biological laboratories. They found advanced design work on prohibited longer-range missiles. They found an elaborate campaign to hide these illegal programs. Still much to investigate. Yet it is now undeniable that Saddam Hussein was in clear violation of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1441.
Though speaking forcefully, many observers say Bush had only revisited the war argument which went on before the invasion and might eventually concede, as his ally, British Prime Minister Tony Blair did, that they are not as sure now as they were before the first strike on Iraq.
The United States of America fought several wars, causing misery to many of its soldiers and to the people of the nations where these battles were fought. Differing countries with diverse languages and people share one thing in common: an American presence justified by various pretexts. The U.S. presence has different declared objectives. One time it was under the pretext containing communism, another time it was under the title of Operation Restore Hope, and the most recent and notable instance is what we are currently witnessing, the global war on terrorism. Taking a quick look at past wars, we can see that the United States was taught a lot of lessons, but learned little. For example, in 1962, the U.S. invaded Vietnam, engaging in fierce battles where thousands of Americans were killed and many more Vietnamese lost their lives. The gruesome war continued until 1971, leaving everlasting effects still being felt today. 28,000 U.S. soldiers were deployed to Somalia for Operation Restore Hope. Afghanistan was the next stop for the U.S. to settle its accounts and restore its stature. However, the wanted suspects are still free. The majority of the funerals belong to people who have nothing to do with restoring American stature. U.S. commanders in Iraq announce daily that soldiers are being killed. Meanwhile, tensions are building up with unknown consequences. Realizing this, the United States proceeded to their next stop. However, they are seeking help from the United Nations, an entity that the United States has previously obstructed.
Mosaic is made possible by a grant from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, which promotes journalism excellence worldwide and invests in the vitality of 26 U.S. communities, and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Additional support is provided by the Firedoll Foundation and Henry and Virgilia Dakin.